The works is gone. Not derelict, gone. Demolished, cleared, redeveloped. Stand on Armoury Road in Small Heath today, and what you find is a concrete frame building from 1915, a fragment, and around it the silence of a site that no longer knows what it once was. 50 years ago, this ground held the largest motorcycle producer in the world. 4,500 workers through those gates every morning. The Queen's Award for Export Achievement in 1967. The same award again in 1968. Bikes leaving this floor for California, for Texas, for every road where a serious rider wanted something that meant something. By April 1972, the gates were shut. The question isn't simply what went wrong. Plenty went wrong, and this film will trace every step of it. The question is how a warning, clearly seen, clearly written down, could sit for 12 years while the floor beneath it slowly gave way. The story of BSA begins long before the fall, and what was built here deserves to be understood before we explain how it was lost. Stand on Armoury Road on a quiet morning and listen. There's traffic on the Coventry Road not far away, and somewhere a dog barks, and the ordinary sounds of a Birmingham morning drift through without weight or meaning. But here, where the old gate line once stood, the air has a particular quality to it, an absence where there should be presence, a silence where, for more than a century, there should have been noise. This is Small Heath. Not a romanticised northern mill town, not a postcard from some imagined past. This is the Midlands, practical, commercial, unsentimental, a part of Birmingham that exists because Birmingham needed workers, and workers needed somewhere to live, and somewhere to live needed a reason to exist. Walk the streets around Armoury Road, and you'll still find the terraced houses that were built to put the workforce within walking distance of those gates. Victorian brick, 2 up, 2 down, the domestic architecture of a city built on making things. They were built after the works, not before. They are the shadow the works cast. Most of the works itself is gone, not fallen into picturesque decay, not standing as a shell awaiting some sympathetic restoration. Gone. Demolished. Cleared. The site has been largely redeveloped, and if you stand in the wrong spot you would not know, could not know, that one of the most significant industrial complexes in the history of British manufacturing once occupied this ground. That what stood here, a vast, sprawling, living, breathing thing, produced the weapons that armed a nation in 2 world wars, and the motorcycles that carried the BSA badge to every corner of the world. What remains is a fragment. Units 1 to 3, a reinforced concrete building from 1915 to 1916, constructed during the first of those wars, engineered using a system that was itself an act of industrial ambition. It stands. The rest does not. In 1967, BSA Motorcycles Limited received the Queen's Award to Industry for Export Achievement. In 1968, they received it again. 2 years running, the state recognised what was being made here, what was being sent out from these floors into the world. By April 1972, the Small Heath Works had been shut down. 4 years. From a Queen's Award to a locked gate. That is the story of this place. That is the question this film will try to answer. Not with anger, and not with smugness, and not with any satisfaction in the fall, but because something was built here, something extraordinary, and it deserves to be properly mourned. They were not romantics, the men who founded the Birmingham Small Arms Company. Romance was for people who could afford it. These were gun trade makers, craftsmen who understood metal, who understood tolerances, who understood the difference between a part that fitted and a part that almost fitted. Birmingham men. Practical, commercially alert, entirely clear-eyed about the opportunity they were moving to seize. The year was 1861. Britain had just come through the uncomfortable discovery, via the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny, that its capacity to arm its own soldiers at the scale that modern warfare demanded was dangerously inadequate. The old way of making firearms, craftsmen working by hand, each part fitted individually, no part interchangeable with any other, was breaking under the pressure of industrial-scale conflict. The American system, as it was called, had demonstrated something new: machines that cut and formed metal to precise tolerances, producing parts that were genuinely interchangeable. You could build a rifle from components made in different rooms by different men, and it would work. You could repair it with parts from a damaged weapon, and it would work. This was not just efficiency, it was a transformation in what manufacturing could be. The founding members of the Birmingham Small Arms trade, who came together in 1861, understood this precisely. They were not starting from nothing. They were men who had spent their working lives in the Birmingham gun trade, who knew the streets of the jewellery quarter and the Small Heath, who understood the labour market, the supply chains, the material. What they did not yet have was scale, mechanised, systematic, industrialised scale. That was what they set out to build. The site they chose was at Small Heath, on Armoury Road. A 25-acre plot, significant, purposeful, chosen not for cheapness, but for what it could become. Construction of the factory began in 1862 and was completed in 1863. It was designed from the start to be something more than a workshop. It was designed to be a works. There is a difference, and the men who founded it knew the difference. A workshop makes things. A works makes things at a scale that changes the nature of making. Think about what that moment was. Not the ribbon cutting, if there was one, or the first machinery installed, or the first shift of workers walking through those gates. Think instead about the conviction it required. To look at a plot of ground in Birmingham in 1862 and see not what was there, but what it was going to be. To believe, against all the usual caution of commercial men who had survived in a competitive trade by not overreaching, that the age of mechanised, interchangeable manufacture had arrived, and that the people who built the infrastructure to serve it would not merely survive, but would define an era. They were right, not immediately, not without difficulty, not in ways that would have been predictable from the vantage point of that first year. But right. The company's early history, its own account, set down for posterity, describes a pattern of continuous expansion that is almost dizzying to follow. The initial 25 acres were a beginning, not an end. Year by year the works grew. New buildings, new machinery, new capabilities, new workers arriving to fill those new roles. By the years before the First World War, the works at Small Heath alone contain more than 26 acres of shop floor space. Not site acreage, shop floor. The space given over to the actual work of making things. 26 acres of machines and benches and workers and product moving from one state to another. To put that in a form you can hold on to. 26 acres is roughly equivalent to 20 football pitches, placed end to end. And that is just the floor space, just the area where the work happened, the site around it, the roads and yards and stores and offices and infrastructure that a works of that size requires. All of that was additional. From the beginning, BSA understood that workers were not simply a resource to be extracted. The company's early accounts describe a welfare infrastructure built alongside the production infrastructure. Surgeries where workers could be treated, free of charge, for the injuries that this kind of work inevitably produced. Training classes. The kinds of provision that spoke to a management that understood at some practical level that you could not ask people to give their working lives to a place without giving something back. Whether that was paternalism or genuine care probably depended on where you were standing. The foreman and the man on the floor might have had different views. But the provision was real, and it mattered. A works that treats its workers as human beings, that maintains a surgery, that runs training programs, that considers itself to have obligations as well as expectations, is a different kind of institution from one that does not. And BSA, from its earliest years, thought of itself as an institution, not just a company, a place, a presence. Something woven into the fabric of Small Heath and, through Small Heath, into the fabric of Birmingham and the wider world it was connected to. That self-understanding of the works as something more than a production facility, as a social entity, a community anchor, a system with obligations and responsibilities, runs through the BSA story like a thread. It is part of what made the collapse, when it came, feel like something more than a business failure. But that is later. In the beginning, there was a cleared site on Armory Road, and men who knew what they were building, and a city that had built itself on exactly this kind of ambition. Birmingham, the city of 1,000 trades. The place where the Industrial Revolution had not been an abstract economic force, but a daily, practical, specific reality, where the streets were named for what was made on them, where children grew up knowing the smell of the forge and the sound of the press as simply the sounds of ordinary life. The Birmingham Small Arms Company was not an interruption in that story. It was a continuation of it. Another chapter in the city's long argument with what was possible. In the beginning, there were rifles, then there were bicycles. It sounds like an odd progression until you understand what connected them. The logic of precision manufacture. The skills that allowed BSA to machine a rifle barrel to fine tolerances, to produce components that were genuinely interchangeable, to manage a complex assembly process with consistency and volume. Those same skills were, it turned out, precisely what the emerging bicycle industry required. Two-wheel transport in the latter decades of the 19th century was not yet the simple, ubiquitous thing it would become. It was a precision product, a product of some technical sophistication, and the market for it was growing fast. BSA moved into bicycle components, and then into bicycles themselves with the same deliberate, commercially alert logic that had characterized its founding. This was not a company that chased novelty. It was a company that recognized where its capabilities aligned with market opportunity and moved toward that alignment with purpose. The site at Small Heath grew around these expanding ambitions. Buildings added to buildings, production halls built alongside production halls. The architectural record that survives in BSA's own history describes almost casually as though it were simply the natural order of things, a scale that takes a moment to absorb. 2 miles of shops 60 feet wide. Think about that not as a statistic, but as a physical experience, walking the length of what was being built, and the walk taking long enough that you might almost forget where you had started. The wars shaped the works as decisively as anything else. The First World War, in particular, drove an expansion that transformed the site. Between 1914 and 1916, Trust Concrete, the company known as Truscon, working with the Caen reinforcement system, built new production halls at Small Heath that were not merely bigger than what had come before. They were built to a different structural logic. Reinforced concrete frames, large window openings to flood the floor with natural light. Wide bays clear of obstructions. The architectural vocabulary of modern industrial production. The building that survives today as Units 1 to 3 is part of what was built in those years. It stands as a witness to what the rest of the site was, even if the rest of the site no longer can. The wartime contribution that the works made across those years is, in the plain language of the record, extraordinary. During the Second World War, BSA's manufacturing base expanded across 67 factories. The weapons produced at Small Heath and across that dispersed network accounted for more than half the guns used by British forces. More than half. Britain asked places like Small Heath to save the nation twice in a generation. And Small Heath did. There is something in that worth pausing over. Not to sentimentalise, and not to suggest that the men and women who worked those floors did so without complexity or hardship or all the ordinary friction of working life. But to understand that when the workers at BSA talked about what they were doing, when they put on their overalls and clocked in and took their place at their machines, they were not simply earning a wage. They were operating within a tradition of making things that mattered, things that, in the extreme case, decided the outcome of conflicts that decided the fate of the world. That is not nothing. It is in fact quite a lot. And the pride that came with it, the specific, grounded Midlands pride, of knowing that what you made was serious and was valued and was not available from anywhere else at that quality and that scale, was not an abstraction. It was a daily reality for the people who worked those floors. After the wars, the company moved fully into motorcycles. The same logic applied to a new market. The obsession with precision and volume that had made rifles by machinery could make engines and frames and the whole intricate assembly of a motorcycle, a product that demanded the same tolerance, the same consistency, the same quality, but now directed toward the civilian market that was re-emerging, hungry and underserved, in the years after 1945. By mid-century, the works at Small Heath was the heart of a motorcycle empire. And in 1951, with the acquisition of Triumph Engineering Company Limited, that empire reached its greatest extent. The combined group, BSA and Triumph under one ownership, became, at that moment, the largest producer of motorcycles in the world, the largest in the world. From a 25-acre site in Small Heath, from gun trade makers who knew that mechanized production was the future, from a century of continuous expansion and adaptation and wartime service to this, the largest motorcycle producer on the planet. If you are looking for a definition of what British industrial ambition could achieve, that moment is as good as any. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what it was. Not in the abstract, not in the language of market share and production volumes and annual reports. In the specific, sensory, irreplaceable reality of what it felt like to work in a place like Small Heath at the peak of what it was. Imagine it is the mid-1950s. The gates on Armoury Road open and the morning shift arrives. Not dribs and drabs, a stream. Hundreds of workers coming from the terraced streets that surround the works, workers who live close enough that they walked here, who have been making this same walk for years, whose fathers made it before them, and in some cases, whose grandfathers made it before that. The sound of boots on tarmac. The particular quality of a Birmingham morning, grey more often than not, the air carrying the familiar mix of damp and distance. The works looms at the end of the street. It has always loomed at the end of this street. This is simply the geography of the place. Through the gates, the works swallows you. Scale is the first thing. 26 acres of shop floor is a number, but what it means, standing inside it, is this. The space keeps going. You walk, and there is more. You look up, and the roof is far overhead, supported by the concrete frame columns that march away in both directions. The light falling through the large windows in long, pale rectangles that shift and change through the day. The floor is concrete, smooth in the lanes where the trolleys and forklifts run, worn in the places where men have stood at the same spot for years. The noise comes first. Before anything else, before you can fully take in the scale or the light or the specific geography of your own section, the noise. A BSA works in full production is not a single sound. It is a dozen sounds layered over each other and folded together into something that feels almost like a physical force. The press rhythms, metal struck and cut and formed, the same beat repeated 1,000 times a day, regular as a heartbeat. The hiss of compressed air from the lines that run through the building, the clatter of components in trays, the rolling of trolleys, the constant movement of material from one stage to another. Voices, brummy voices, cutting through the noise in the particular way that Midland's speech does, direct and practical, with no wasted syllables. The smell in the air is oil, always oil. Cutting fluid in particular, the liquid that keeps the machines and the metal from destroying each other in the process of shaping, has a particular character that no amount of ventilation fully removes. It is not unpleasant. After a time, it is simply the smell of the place, as familiar and unremarkable as the smell of your own home. Underneath it, faintly, hot metal. The particular sharp note of metal being worked, a smell with an edge to it. And somewhere, always, tea. The canteen dispensing tea through every shift, because tea is not a luxury on a factory floor, it is a necessity. The floor vibrates. Not violently, this is not a place that feels unstable or dangerous in that way. But there is a constant low-level tremor underfoot, the transmitted energy of all those machines running at once. A kind of aliveness in the floor that you feel through the soles of your feet and through your legs, and after a long shift, deep in your body. Workers who spent years in that building stopped noticing it. Visitors noticed it immediately. The work itself was skilled work. This is worth saying plainly because it sometimes gets lost in the general description of factory work as if factory work were all the same thing. It was not. The men and the women, particularly during the wartime years and in the permanent workforce thereafter, who worked the BSA floor were not interchangeable units performing mindless operations. They were machinists, fitters, inspectors, testers. They were people who knew what a motorcycle engine should sound like when it ran correctly and what it sounded like when it didn't. They were people who understood tolerances and materials and the particular demands of a product that needed to perform reliably under conditions that could be brutal. An apprenticeship at BSA was not a formality. It was a real process of instruction and accumulation, taking years, moving from simpler operations to more complex ones, building a body of knowledge that could not be acquired quickly or without effort. A boy who started at 16, and many did start at 16, arrived as someone who could not yet be trusted with the more demanding work. He left, 5 years later, as someone who could, and in between there were the older workers who taught him. Men who had been doing this for decades, who knew every machine on the floor, not because they had read about them, but because they had run them. That knowledge passed, person to person, year by year. It was not written down anywhere complete. It lived in the hands and eyes and accumulated judgment of the workforce. When you understand that the capability of a works like this is not just the machinery, not just the buildings, but the human knowledge embedded in the workforce, you begin to understand what is really lost when a place like this closes. The wage packet came on Fridays. Literally a packet, an envelope, handed over at the end of the week containing the physical wages for the hours worked. In the post-war years, the wages at BSA were good by the standards of what was available, better than many alternatives. There were pension provisions, above the engineering industry average by BSA's own account. There was the surgery, on-site medical provision for the injuries that this kind of work, however well managed, inevitably produced. There was the structure of a large employer that had thought, however imperfectly, about its obligations to the people who worked for it. For many workers, this translated into something that was genuinely rare in working-class life: security. Not comfort, necessarily, and not luxury. But the ground-level certainty that the job would still be there tomorrow. That if you did your work, and kept your nose clean, and put in the years, you would arrive at retirement with a pension that was worth something. That your children would have the same option you had, the option of starting here at 16 and building a life around this place. Many took that option. Employment at BSA ran in families. A father would speak to a foreman, a son would start. This was not patronage in the corrupt sense, you still had to do the work, but it was a recognition that the workforce reproduced itself, that the human infrastructure of a place like this was maintained partly through inheritance, through the passing on of not just practical skills, but a relationship with the institution itself. The works hooter marked time for the whole neighbourhood. Shift changes announced themselves to streets that had long since learned what the sound meant. Time to go in, time to come out, time to have your tea. The rhythm of the works was the rhythm of the neighbourhood. When the hooter sounded, curtains moved and doors opened, and the streets briefly filled with the particular purposeful movement of people going somewhere that mattered. Small Heath did not exist before the works. Not in its current form, not at its current scale. The terraced streets that surrounded the Armoury Road site were built to house the workforce that the works required. Practical provision for a practical need. Victorian brick going up row by row as employment grew and families arrived. The factory came first. The town came after. And the town understood, at some deep, inarticulate level, that this was the order of things. The 1953 photographs of Armoury Road show this with a clarity that no amount of description can fully match. There is the works, enormous, its wall running along the street's edge, a presence rather than merely a building. And there, in the same frame, are the terraced houses. Domestic and industrial, side by side, sharing the same street, the same light, the same geography. Not separate worlds. The same world. The pubs in Small Heath understood the shift patterns. The corner shops knew when the men came past and stocked accordingly. The working men's clubs, the sports teams, the chapel congregations, all of these were shaped, one way or another, by the fact of the works. What the works made possible, a steady wage, a pensionable job, a certain security, flowed outward into the rest of the community's life. You could support a family on a BSA wage. You could buy a house. You could put something aside. Not easily and not without the ordinary hardships of working-class life, but the foundation was there in a way it was not everywhere. And BSA, the institution, was present in the civic life of Small Heath, in the way that large employers often were in that era, present not just as a source of wages, but as a kind of anchor around which everything else organised itself. The works had been there before most of the people living in those streets were born. It would, presumably, be there after them. It was simply part of what Small Heath was. By the early 1950s, the badge on the tank of a BSA motorcycle was not just a corporate logo. It was a declaration of origin. It meant Birmingham. It meant Small Heath. It meant the skills and traditions of the people who had built it. In markets that valued that, in America particularly, which was BSA's crucial export market, the badge meant something. It meant a machine that had been made with care and knowledge and the particular kind of craft pride that the Midlands had always carried in its manufacturing. The 1951 acquisition of Triumph brought the two most powerful names in British motorcycling under one ownership. As a combined entity, BSA and Triumph controlled a share of world motorcycle production that no other manufacturer could match. In the United States, the market that mattered most, the market that consumed the largest volume, and where BSA had worked hardest to build its reputation, British motorcycles were not a niche. They were a significant presence. In the late 1960s, in certain segments of the American market, British manufacturers held close to half the market share. Half. The bikes that carried the BSA badge in those years were not gentle machines. They were built for riders who wanted performance and presence and something that stood apart from the ordinary. The Gold Star, the competition model that became a cultural touchstone, the bike that serious riders wanted, was born out of a genuine competition history, out of the tradition of racing and record-breaking that BSA had maintained alongside its production work. When a man in California or Texas or New York bought a BSA, he was buying into something, a lineage, a provenance, a machine made by people who understood what a motorcycle should be. In 1967, BSA Motorcycles Limited received the Queen's Award to Industry for Export Achievement. That same year, Triumph Engineering Company Limited received the same award. In 1968, both received it again. The Queen's Award to Industry was not given lightly. It required demonstrated, sustained, exceptional performance in export markets. The fact that BSA and Triumph received it 2 years in succession was not a formality or a courtesy. It was an official recognition at the highest level that what was being built on Armoury Road and sent out to the world represented something genuinely remarkable about British manufacturing capability. This was the summit. These were the years of peak recognition, of public acknowledgement that what had been built here from that 25-acre site in 1862 through 2 world wars and a century of continuous expansion had achieved something worth celebrating. It is important to sit with that for a moment, not to rush past it toward what came next. Because what was here in 1967 and 1968 was not a failing industry desperately clutching at honours it hadn't earned. It was, by every measurable standard, a genuine world leader. The works on Armoury Road was the heart of the world's largest motorcycle producer. The badge on the tank meant something in every market that mattered. The workers who came through those gates every morning were, in a real and demonstrable sense, some of the finest motorcycle manufacturers on earth. The highest point. Employment across the BSA group, in the years of post-war production, peaked at around 8,500. The works at Small Heath alone employed thousands of people who walked through those Armoury Road gates every morning, and through whose hands the product passed from raw material to finished machine. The floors that had been building to this capacity for a century were, at this moment, doing the thing they had been built to do. In the boardrooms and the executive offices, the mood was confident. Not reckless, but confident in the way that an organization becomes when it has been successful for long enough that success starts to feel like a natural condition rather than a thing that has to be continually earned. BSA was the world's largest motorcycle producer. It had just received the highest honor the state could give to an exporting company. The American market, the market that mattered, was healthy. The bikes were selling, the orders were coming in. What happened in the boardrooms in those years, the specific conversations, the precise calculations, is difficult to recover in detail. But the shape of the thinking can be understood from the decisions that followed. There was confidence that the position was secure. There was a belief that the brand was strong enough to carry what it needed to carry. There was, perhaps, a tendency to read the present as a reliable guide to the future. 7 years earlier, in September 1960, Edward Turner had returned from a visit to Japan with a report that should have been read very carefully. Turner was not a peripheral figure. He was a senior man within the BSA group, and his position gave his assessment authority. What he had seen in Japan shocked him. The scale of production, Honda approaching 250,000 units, the Japanese industry as a whole producing well over 500,000 motorcycles a year, against Britain's approximately 140,000. The quality, the speed of model development, the level of technical investment, and technical staffing. Japan was not an aspiring competitor struggling to catch up. Japan was already a different kind of operation. Turner's report was not a secret. It was written for BSA leadership. It was a warning, direct and detailed, from a man who had seen the evidence with his own eyes. In 1967, as the Queen's Award was accepted and the export figures were celebrated, that report was 7 years old. The tide that Turner had seen in Japan was not receding. It was building. In one crucial segment of the American market, the segment where British bikes had built their reputation and their market share, British manufacturers held around 49% of the market in 1969. Nearly half. A position that looked, from inside those boardrooms, like security. It was not security. It was the last moment before the fall. But standing at the summit, looking out at what had been built, the cliff was not visible. This was the moment, the highest point before everything changed. Those words are easy to write now. They were impossible to see then. There is a particular kind of danger that comes with being right for a very long time. When a company has built well and built carefully, and the market has rewarded that building for decades, something happens to the way decisions get made. The feedback loop that should connect choice to consequence starts to carry a different signal. Success, sustained long enough, starts to look like vindication, not of specific choices, but of a general approach, a general instinct, a general set of assumptions about how the world works. And when the world begins to change, those assumptions are often the last thing to change with it. Edward Turner had seen it in 1960. The report he brought back from Japan was not speculative. It was observational. He had stood in Japanese facilities and watched what was happening. Honda was approaching 250,000 units a year. The Japanese industry as a whole was producing well over 500,000. Against Britain's 140,000. The gap was not a gap in ambition or in technical knowledge. Japan had both of those. The gap was one of scale, and the scale was producing something more than volume. It was producing the capital and the capacity to invest in the next generation of product while still selling the current one. More than that, and this was the detail that should have registered most sharply with anyone reading Turner's report, Japan was not competing on price alone. The bikes coming out of Honda's factories were not cheap imitations of British machines. They were different machines, cleaner, more reliable, easier to start. Engineered for a rider who did not have the patience or the skills or the inclination to learn the particular temperament of a British twin. And the market for that kind of rider was large. It was, in fact, the largest market of all, the mass market. The ordinary buyers who wanted transport that simply worked every time without drama or negotiation. In Britain, the response to Turner's report was to understand it, to commission it, to read it, to file it, and then, not through malice and not through stupidity, but through the deep and very human tendency to continue doing what has worked, to carry on. The early 1960s were not years of visible crisis. The American market was still strong. The Queen's Awards were still coming. The bikes were still selling. From inside the organisation, looking at the numbers, there was no obvious emergency requiring an emergency response. The threat Turner had described was real, but it was a medium-term threat, a cloud on the horizon, not rain on the roof. And medium-term threats have a way of being managed, deferred, noted, and returned to later. They were returned to later. But later, it turned out, was too late. The structural vulnerabilities that the PhD research on BSA's decline identifies were not dramatic in themselves. They were the quiet accumulations of an organisation under pressure from multiple directions at once. The facilities at Small Heath were ageing. The machinery that had been installed in the post-war expansion was not getting younger, and the investment in replacing or upgrading it, the capital expenditure that would have kept the production lines current, was not being made at the rate that competitive pressure required. Honda and its Japanese peers were investing. The comparison in net fixed investment per worker between the British motorcycle industry and Honda was not a comfortable one. There was diversification too. BSA, as a large industrial group, had interests beyond motorcycles. That was not inherently wrong. Diversification can spread risk, build capability, provide growth where core markets are mature. But diversification is a thing that requires management attention, capital, and focus, and all three of those are finite. When the core business, the motorcycle business, the beating heart of what made BSA what it was, needed precisely those resources most urgently, they were spread across a wider set of priorities. The American market told the story most clearly. In 1969, British manufacturers still held close to half the market in a key segment. That number looked like strength. It also disguised what was happening in the rest of the market, the parts where Japanese volume was growing fastest, where new customers were arriving who had no prior loyalty to. British brands, who were choosing on the basis of what they could see in front of them. Reliability, electric starting, service networks, consistent parts supply. Japanese manufacturers were building all of those systematically, while British manufacturers were defending what they had. Defending what you have is not the same as building what you need. It is a different posture with different consequences, and by the late 1960s, the consequences were beginning to compound. By 1970, something that had been a competitive disadvantage was becoming a financial one. The losses started showing. Not gradually, not in small, absorbable increments, but in figures that required explanation to shareholders. Explanations that, when they came, used phrases like dislocation of production and delayed new models. And the careful, sombre language of a company that knows its results are difficult to read and is trying to frame them honestly without triggering panic. The panic, when it came, was not irrational. It was proportionate. It was, in fact, somewhat overdue. The decisions that ended the works at Small Heath were not made in an afternoon. They accumulated. Each one followed a logic that, at the time, seemed defensible. Each one was a response to a problem that was genuinely pressing. Each one was, in the context of everything else that was happening, the kind of choice that experienced people in difficult positions make when they are trying to hold something together. And together, one after another, they closed off the futures that might otherwise have remained open. The first pattern was the retreat from market share. This sounds abstract until you understand what it meant in practice. When Japanese competition began to take volume in the lower and middle tiers of the market, the bikes that ordinary riders bought, the bread and butter production that sustained the overhead of a large works. BSA's strategic response was, broadly, to cede that ground and concentrate on the higher margin segments. Premium machines, sporting machines. The territory where British heritage and reputation gave the brand an advantage that Japanese competitors couldn't yet match on pure price or specification. The logic was comprehensible. Margins matter. Fighting for low-margin volume against competitors who are structurally more efficient at producing it is not necessarily a winning strategy. Retreating to higher ground, to the segments where your reputation has the most value, can make sense as a defensive move, a way of buying time while the competitive landscape clarifies. What it doesn't do is sustain the scale of production that a works like Small Heath required. 26 acres of shop floor needs volume to justify its existence. The overhead of a facility that size, the workforce, the maintenance, the heat and light and infrastructure does not decrease proportionally when output drops. You can retreat to a premium position, but you cannot retreat to a premium position and maintain a mass production works. The mathematics of it don't work. The second pattern was the diversification. BSA in the late 1960s was not simply a motorcycle company. It had moved into other areas, other products, other markets, other businesses that seemed, at the time of acquisition or expansion, to offer growth or stability or strategic logic. Some of those investments drew resources away from the motorcycle operation at precisely the moment that the motorcycle operation needed those resources most. Again, this is not stupidity. This is the kind of thing that happens to large industrial groups and has happened throughout industrial history, and will doubtless happen again. The logic of each individual diversification decision is usually coherent enough. It is only when you stand back and look at all of them together and look at what was happening to the core business while they were being pursued that the cumulative cost becomes visible. By 1971, the cumulative cost was visible. The cash position at BSA had become critical. The bank indebtedness was real and growing, and the warnings about insolvency risk, not hypothetical warnings, but assessments based on the actual numbers, were being taken seriously at the highest levels of the company. This was not a business going through a rough patch. This was a business that was looking at the near future and finding it very difficult to see how it continued. The response was swift in the way that only genuine crisis produces. The Small Heath payroll, which had stood at 4,500, was cut to 1,500. 3,000 jobs gone in the name of cash conservation. The people who held those jobs had, in many cases, worked on that floor for decades. Some had followed their fathers there, some had sons who had followed them. The idea that this work was permanent, that the works, having survived 2 world wars and a century of everything that history could throw at it, would simply continue, had been part of the fabric of how people in Small Heath understood their world. In 1971, that understanding was disassembled. BSA's own explanation to shareholders, its 1971 statement, produced at the height of the crisis, used language that has a particular quality when read now. Measured. Responsible. Honest, within the limits of what honesty could do at that point. Dislocation of production. Delayed new models. Management errors. The company's own words, acknowledging the management errors. Not a single villain, not a conspiracy, not bad luck in isolation. Management errors, the kind of thing that happens when organizations lose their way, when the feedback loops that connect decisions to consequences are operating on a delay long enough that you can't clearly see what you've caused. On the 14th of April, 1972, the Small Heath works was shut down. Not mothballed. Not temporarily suspended pending a recovery plan. Shut down. The gates closed, the machines fell silent, and the floor that had been alive with noise and oil and the specific, irreplaceable energy of skilled people making things went quiet. There is a temptation, approaching a moment like that, to look for the person who caused it. The face to attach to the failure. The decision that, if reversed, would have changed everything. It is a natural impulse tragedy asks for an author. But the truth of what happened at BSA is more complicated and, in its way, more sorrowful than a simple narrative of culpable individuals allows. A senior man had returned from Japan in 1960 with a warning that was both accurate and insufficient. Insufficient because the scale of what was coming was beyond what British management culture of that era was equipped to respond to. The decisions to prioritise margins over volume, to diversify rather than concentrate, to defend rather than transform, each of those decisions had a logic to it. Each was made by people who were trying to preserve something they believed in. They couldn't see what was coming quickly enough. Or they could see it, and couldn't find a path to a response that the organisation was capable of making. These things are not always distinguishable from the outside. What is clear is this. By the time the gates closed in April 1972, the warning had been sitting in a file for 12 years. There will have been a last shift. There will have been a morning, probably an ordinary Birmingham morning, grey and unremarkable in all the usual ways, when the workers who remained on the reduced payroll walked through those gates for the last time. Not all at once, perhaps. The closure of an operation like this is not a clean, single event. It is a process, a series of diminishments, each one smaller and quieter than the one before, until the thing is simply gone. But somewhere in that process, there was a last day. A last time the hooter sounded. A last time the machines ran. A last time a finished motorcycle left this floor. By 1971, the workforce had already been reduced from 4,500 to 1,500. 1,500 people where 4,500 had been. The floor was not full. The canteen was not full. The car park, which had once held cars for thousands of workers arriving in waves at shift change, had gaps in it that you could not avoid noticing. 3,000 people had gone. The people who remained understood what the gaps meant. They were not incapable of reading what was in front of them. The trade unions at Small Heath had maintained, through the years of the works operation, a relationship with management that was, by the standards of British industrial relations in that era, relatively constructive. When the shutdown came, when the decision had been made and the redundancy notices were issued, the response was not what it might have been in places where the relationship had been more adversarial. There was anger. Of course there was anger. There was grief and disorientation and the particular helplessness of people who have given their working lives to a place and are now being told that the place no longer has use for them. But the shutdown proceeded with a degree of cooperation that, in another set of circumstances, might not have been available. The workers at Small Heath were not people who wanted to make things worse. They had a stake in the institution. They always had. The redundancy payments that were made, the formal recognition that workers were leaving jobs they had held, in some cases for decades, could not compensate for what was actually being lost. This is not a criticism of the payment. It is a statement about the nature of what was at stake. A redundancy payment addresses the financial consequence of job loss. It does not address the loss of purpose, of structure, of identity, of the particular dignity that comes from being a person who makes things with their hands and knows how to make them well. The men who left Small Heath in 1971 and 1972 were not going to a labour market that was eager to absorb them. The skills they carried, specific, deep, accumulated over years of working on this floor, were not skills that transferred easily to other industries. Machining for motorcycles is machining for motorcycles. The knowledge of how a particular engine should sound when it runs correctly, of how a frame should feel when it is properly assembled, of what tolerances matter and which can be managed, none of that was easily relocated. It belonged to this floor, to this product, to this tradition. Some of those men found work, some did not. Some retrained, with the mixed success that retraining programs have always had when the gap between the old skill and the new one is too wide to bridge quickly. Some simply waited, for the work to come back, for something equivalent to appear, for the world to restore what it had taken. The work did not come back. Nothing equivalent appeared. In April 1972, the gates closed. In July 1973, 16 months after the Small Heath shutdown, BSA's survival as an independent company effectively ended. After 112 years, from those Birmingham gun trade makers who had met in 1861 and seen what mechanised production could become, the company's shareholders agreed to a restructuring that brought government backing and created, in place of BSA, a new entity, Norton Villiers Triumph. The government subscribed substantial funding. The state stepped in where the market had failed, or where the market had done what markets do and moved on. There is a kind of institutional death that is distinct from a simple business failure. BSA had not simply lost money and closed. It had been for over a century a presence in Small Heath, in Birmingham, in British manufacturing, in the markets of the world. It had armed a nation twice over. It had built the bikes that carried the badge to California and Texas and the roads of a dozen other countries. It had been the reason those streets of terraced housing existed. The reason generations of families in Small Heath had a floor to work on and a wage to come home with. That presence was now over. The silence came in stages. First the hooter stopped, then the machines, then the voices. Then, as the buildings were cleared and the equipment stripped out, the particular echoing quality of a large empty space, sound bouncing off concrete and glass and nothing else. The acoustic of a building with no contents. And then, eventually, the buildings themselves. Most of them were demolished in the 1970s. Not all at once, not ceremonially, not with any particular attention from outside the neighbourhood. Large industrial buildings are demolished the same way they are built, in sections, methodically, by workers doing a job. Walls come down, roofs come off. The floor, which had carried the weight of all that work, is broken up. The site, cleared, awaits whatever comes next. For Small Heath, what came next was redevelopment. The land that the works had occupied, the acres on Armoury Road where the rifle production and the bicycle frames and the motorcycle engines had been made for over a century, was built on again. Not with factory buildings, with whatever the planners and developers of the 1970s and 1980s and after judged appropriate. Housing. Industrial units of a different kind. The ordinary things that fill cleared ground. The workers' welfare structures that BSA had maintained, the surgeries, the training provisions, the pension arrangements that had been described as above the engineering industry average, could not survive the company's collapse. Workers who had been counting on their pension, who had built their retirement expectations around what BSA had promised, found themselves dependent instead on whatever the government-backed settlement could deliver. This was not nothing, but it was not what had been expected. The community that had been built around the works did not immediately collapse. Communities have a resilience that is easy to underestimate, a capacity to continue, to adapt, to maintain their social fabric even when the economic reason for their existence has been removed. The pubs stayed open. The working men's clubs continued for some years. The terraced streets went on being streets, the houses went on being homes, the people who lived there went on being neighbours. Small Heath continued to be Small Heath. But it was a different thing. A town built around a reason, after the reason is gone, is not the same town. It looks the same for a while. The physical fabric continues, the daily routines continue. But something underneath has shifted. Some weight-bearing element of the collective life has been removed, and the structure above it, though it stands differently. The BSA name did not disappear entirely. The motorcycle mark, the badge that had meant something in the American market, that had carried the reputation of Armoury Road to riders on roads the people who built it never saw, survived, in various forms, through ownership changes and brand revivals. Decades later, the name would be acquired by new custodians, and the Gold Star name, the designation that had once meant the finest sporting motorcycle that Birmingham's skills could produce, would be applied to new machines made in different circumstances, in a different era, carrying a heritage that the people who created it could not have anticipated. That is not nothing either. Names carry something. The fact that the BSA Gold Star exists in the world, that people associate that name with a tradition of quality and with the history of Armoury Road, is a form of continuity. It is also, if you allow yourself to look at it directly, a measure of what was lost. The name survived. The place mostly did not. The badge outlasted the floor it was built on. Go back to Armoury Road now. The surviving fragment, Units 1 to 3, the reinforced concrete building constructed during the First World War, the Truscon engineered structure with its cairn reinforcement and its large window openings and its concrete frame columns, is still there. It stands. It has a solidity to it that is appropriate to its origins. This was built to last, built to serve an industry that understood the difference between construction that would hold and construction that would not. But it fails to communicate what it once was part of. This is the peculiar cruelty of partial survival. If the whole works had been demolished, every building, every wall, every trace removed, there would at least be a complete absence, which has its own clarity. What the fragment gives you instead is a remnant that is too small to represent the whole and too present to let you forget it. You can stand before Units 1 to 3 and understand, intellectually, that this was one building among many, that the site it occupied was a fraction of the total, that the 26 acres of shop floor space, described in BSA's own history, extended far beyond anything that remains visible today. You can understand it intellectually. You cannot feel it. The feeling requires imagination, requires the effort of reconstruction, holding what you can see against what the record tells you existed, and trying to inhabit the gap between them. What occupied this site was not a factory in the ordinary sense. It was a city within a city. It had its own internal geography, its own social systems, its own rhythms and rituals and hierarchies. It had surgeries and canteens and training rooms and testing bays. It had the full human complexity of a large institution, the characters and the disputes and the loyalties and the quiet solidarities that develop when people spend their working lives together. 4,500 workers at the peak. 4,500 people who knew this floor, who could navigate its geography without thinking, who understood where they were and what they were doing, and what it all meant. Now there is a concrete frame building from 1915, and around it, redevelopment, and around that, the terraced streets that were built because the works existed. The streets outlasted the works. This is perhaps the most telling detail of all. The houses that were built to put the workforce within walking distance of the gates, the domestic infrastructure of the industrial enterprise, those are still standing. The people who live there now mostly did not work at BSA. Some of them were not born when the gates closed. The houses exist in a relationship to the works that is now purely historical, a connection they carry without necessarily knowing what it means. Walk those streets on a quiet morning, and you can still feel the logic of them. The way they face toward where the works was, the way the scale of them suggests a community organised around something larger than itself, something that has since been removed. The streets are the afterimage of an industrial system that no longer exists. And so we come back to the beginning. The Armory Road gate that no longer stands. The hooter that no longer sounds. The floor, 26 acres of it, give or take, covered in machines and workers and the constant particular energy of making things, which is now redeveloped ground, carrying the weight of different purposes. BSA had been established in 1861 by men who understood precision and volume and the commercial opportunities of mechanized manufacture. It had built a works that armed a nation twice, that employed thousands, that produced the bikes that carried a badge to every part of the world where motorcycles were ridden and admired. It had received the highest honour a British exporting company could receive, twice in consecutive years, and then, within 4 years of that recognition, had closed its central works and begun the process of institutional collapse that ended its independence entirely by July 1973. 112 years. From those Birmingham gun trade makers who met in 1861 to the shareholders' agreement that ended BSA's independent existence. 112 years of building and serving and employing and making things that the world wanted. 4 years from award to closure. What was lost here was not simply a company. It was not simply a collection of jobs, though the jobs mattered profoundly to the people who held them and the families who depended on them. It was something harder to name and easier to feel, a form of knowledge, embedded in the hands and eyes and accumulated judgment of thousands of workers that cannot be reconstructed once it is dispersed. The machinist who spent 40 years on this floor knew things that are not in any manual. The foreman who trained a generation of apprentices passed on something that cannot be written down and sent to a new location. When the floor went quiet, that knowledge went with it. The terraced houses of Small Heath still stand. The streets are still streets, and the people in them are still people, living lives of ordinary complexity and dignity. The neighbourhood did not disappear. It continued, as communities continue, finding new meanings and new reasons and new ways of understanding itself. But there are questions that communities built around a specific purpose carry with them when the purpose is gone. Questions that don't resolve cleanly. What are we for now? What replaces the thing that made us what we were? Where does the pride go, the particular, grounded, Midlands pride, of knowing that what you made was serious and valued and not available from anywhere else? These are not questions with answers, they are questions with weight. Units 1 to 3 carries that weight, imperfectly, inadequately, honestly. A fragment of what was built during a war that the works helped to win, standing in a site that the works once filled, in a neighbourhood that the works once defined. It cannot tell you what it was like when the floor was alive. It can only suggest the shape of the absence. If you stand there on a quiet morning, before the traffic builds on the Coventry Road, before Small Heath reassembles its ordinary daily noise, and you let yourself attend to the silence, you will hear something. Not the machines, not the hooter, not the voices of 4,000 workers arriving for the morning shift, the rhythm of boots on tarmac, the brummy conversation carrying through the cold air, the silence. And under the silence, if you listen carefully enough, the question that nobody answered in time. What happens to a place when its reason for existing disappears?